So we have now discovered that the scientific account of creation exactly matches the biblical account. The other big area that Christians and scientists get hung up on is evolution, so let's look at that one next. First of all, evolution and adaptation is absolutely real. We see it happening all the time. We see viruses mutate to adapt to vaccines. We see bacteria mutate to become resistant to antibiotics. And it's not just with microscopic creatures either. Darwin observed evolutionary adaptation within finches, and we see many species evolve new traits when they are separated from the rest of their population on remote islands. So we know that evolution happens. The question is, does it conflict with anything in the Bible? No. We just saw how the Bible lists the order in which the creatures were made, and it exactly coincides with what we see in the geologic record on which the theory of evolution is based. Wait. Let me stop you right there. It occurred to me while I was editing this that some of you may argue that while the larger macro evolutionary picture matches the Bible, it's actually the smaller scale changes that conflict with the Bible. In other words, science says that God created each animal after its kind, and the idea that a human extended from a monkey doesn't seem to fit that. Okay, we've all seen this picture. But this is a simplistic rendering of what evolution is really all about. In practice, the evolutionary changes are happening on a very small scale. Let's look at those finches again. A finch doesn't just one day become an eagle, for example. It becomes a finch with a slightly longer beak or a slightly stockier build. As these changes start adding up slowly over time, we eventually might say, hey, this one's different enough that we should probably call it something else. But what the Bible says still applies. Each baby bird was a little different from its parent, but each one descended from its own kind. And the line of demarcation between where one species becomes another is in fact quite blurred. Now, every now and again, a lot of these small changes may add up all at once, or a mutation might creep in wherein a large change happens all at one time. But by far and large, we're mostly talking about small, subtle changes happening over a very long period of time. Now, if you're really headstrong about this, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. We as humans have Neanderthal DNA in our genetic structure, indicating that our two species shared a common ancestor. And if you've ever watched one of those forensic crime shows, then you know that it's really hard to argue against DNA evidence. Okay, back to the show. The only way you have a scientific conflict is if you hold to the notion that the events in creation happened over a period of 7 literal days. And we've already discussed how the things I've suggested fit into the greater context of the Bible without conflict, and even reconcile apparent contradictions that the 24-hour day interpretation creates. And we even discover that this interpretation even reconciles apparent scientific inconsistencies that Satan has been leveraging for decades to undermine God's credibility. This interpretation defeats those efforts of the enemy. One thing that is interesting is how the Bible describes the process by which animals were created. In Genesis 2:19, we're told, "Out of the ground the Lord formed every beast." What makes this interesting is that it coincides with the scientific explanation as well. According to astronomers, there was a large star before our sun that went supernova, and this explosion created all the elements on the periodic table and scattered that dusty mess into space. Gravity then once again started pulling that material together, eventually forming the sun and the planets and all the other stuff that we talked about earlier. If we were to look at the elements that your body is made out of, we would find the same elements present in the ground. You are indeed made from the very same elements as the dust of the earth, which in turn was made from this stardust that was left over from the supernova explosion. And the star that exploded came from the Big Bang that God created. The Bible could have said that God snapped his fingers and created man or beast from nothing at all, but it doesn't. It says that we were all created from the dust of the earth, exactly as predicted by science. Now, don't get me wrong here. God still made all the living things. I am convinced that if you put all of the building blocks of life together in a jar and shook it for 1 billion years or longer, and it still wouldn't even form a single cell. And even if it did, that cell wouldn't be alive. The complexity of living things is too great to be an accident. God may have used natural processes to bring the pieces together, but I am convinced that those pieces only become alive because God willed it to happen. Indeed, Genesis 2:4 says that God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Building blocks don't become alive without this direct intervention of God. If they could, then we would be able to reanimate people from the dead. When a person dies, all the elements of the living thing are still there. We should be able to replace the defective part and reanimate them. The fact that we can't is evidence that the breath of life that makes it all work has been removed. The process by which God assembles the dust of the earth into living things is not cited in the Bible. It just says that he did it. So when it comes to evolution, whether animals and people were created in an instant or evolved over time, neither one of those interpretations would undermine the text of the Bible in any way. So if we have evidence to support evolution on some scale and it doesn't conflict or undermine God's word, then why should we as Christians have a problem with it at all? Now, I know what you're probably thinking. The idea of Adam evolving doesn't seem to fit with the biblical account, and you're absolutely right. But Adam and Eve are only one part of the story. Let's describe the origin of man next, and we'll see if we can reconcile this apparent problem with evolution. The notion that the universe is only 6,000 years old is one that has been circulating within the church for quite a while now, and it directly relates to our question about whether or not evolution is an anti-biblical concept. Let's start by looking at where this young Earth idea came from and what science has to say about the age of the universe. Science says that the age of the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and the age of the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. It is possible that errors in our calculations and errors in assumptions and methods which we use to arrive at these numbers are, in fact, wrong. In fact, these ages have been adjusted periodically throughout time as we make new discoveries, develop new technologies, and fine-tune our observations. But the idea that our observations are off by that kind of magnitude, the difference between 6,000 and 4.6 billion years, the evidence just doesn't support anything like that. In Luke chapter 19, we see a multitude of disciples praising God, and the Pharisees want Jesus to tell them to be quiet.
And Jesus answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out.
In other words, you can't silence the truth about God. If you attempt to do so, his creation will speak the truth in their stead. This verse is not unlike the account from Psalms where we see astronomy pointing us back to the Creator. We can use the rock and fossil history of Earth's geologic timescale to definitively prove the age of the Earth is older than 6,000 years. So where did this notion come from? And if it's based in biblical truth, how do we reconcile it with the evidence God has provided us within the geologic record of his creation? This chart depicts the 6,000 years of history depicted in the Bible. It lists everything that we know. For example, starting here, this is today, and it goes all the way back to the birth and death of Christ. And then we also have many of these yellow lines are depicting the descendants of Jesus. And so if we list all of the descendants going back all the way as far as they go, we get Adam and Eve at about 4,000 BC. So 4,000 years plus 2,000 years since Jesus' death gets us to the 6,000 year number. Now we know all of this because many of the people listed in the Bible, their ages are actually cited in the Bible. And even sometimes it even tells us how old the person was when they had their children. But not all of the time. So there is a little bit of guesswork in here, and that's why you see some overlap between each of the yellow lines. So even if we were to stretch all of these out to the furthest extent possible whenever any guesswork was made, it still wouldn't even get you to 10,000 years. So somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 is the absolute maximum that we could be. But that still doesn't get you anywhere near the 4.5 billion years established by science. Let me be clear. I'm a firm believer that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years old. The abundance of scientific evidence clearly proves that. But I have carefully researched this chart, and it's legit. All of the information presented here was taken straight out of the Bible, and the presentation appears to be pretty ironclad. But it conflicts with the geologic record. Remember, God tells us that we can use His creation to bring Him glory, and science is the means by which we do that. If our interpretation of His Word is out of sync with our interpretation of His creation, then one of our interpretations is flawed. It's unreasonable to think that God would build something into His creation that would intentionally confuse His people, so we must be missing something. All of this starts with Adam, so that's where we should start too. In Genesis 2:7, we read that God formed man out of the dust of the earth. Now wait a minute, didn't we just see in chapter 1 that God created man? Most biblical scholars would explain this as one of those parenthetical citations we were talking about earlier. The idea is that in Genesis chapter 1, it gives us a broad illustration of the creation. And in chapter 2, we're going back in the timeline to provide additional details. That's certainly one way to interpret it, and probably the way that you were taught in your Sunday school class. But is there another interpretation? One that could fit both the geological timeline but also not conflict with any other area of the Bible? Remember, we can and should reject any interpretations that create inconsistencies or contradictions in the Bible. I'm going to offer you one possible explanation that at first will sound totally unreasonable. It will seem like it's in direct conflict with numerous other verses in the Bible. But we'll address each one of these apparent conflicts and ultimately find that this solution does fit. So stick with me.